The first indication that something irreversible had happened was not the statement itself. It was the silence inside the secure communications room in Brussels. At 6:42 a.m., three senior trade envoys from Europe stopped speaking mid-sentence as the notification appeared across their encrypted briefing screens. One advisor slowly removed his glasses. Another leaned back without saying a word. A NATO economic liaison standing near the far wall lowered his phone and stared at the floor for nearly 6 seconds before asking a question nobody in the room was prepared to answer. Did Washington actually do it? Outside, rain pressed against the windows of the Alliance complex. Motorcades were already arriving. Television networks had not yet understood the scale of the story. Markets in Asia were still open. Futures contracts in Frankfurt had begun sliding. And somewhere between Ottawa, Washington, and London, officials realized the geopolitical architecture holding the Western economic bloc together had just fractured in public view. Donald Trump had been removed from the Alliance of 47, not suspended, not censured, removed. The wording mattered, because alliances do not remove major powers unless the internal trust has already collapsed behind closed doors. And within less than 90 minutes, another detail began spreading through diplomatic channels with even greater force. Mark Carney was taking operational control of the Emergency Economic Coordination Framework. That was the moment the atmosphere changed entirely. Phones began vibrating across ministries in Berlin, Tokyo, Paris, Singapore, and Ottawa. Currency desks opened emergency communication lines. Sovereign wealth funds requested overnight risk assessments. Treasury officials in multiple capitals quietly postponed planned bond auctions. By mid-morning, analysts at two major investment banks had already begun circulating internal memos using language rarely seen outside systemic crises. Alliance credibility event, governance rupture, strategic realignment risk. The problem was larger than the deal itself. What officials feared was not a political disagreement. It was institutional unpredictability. And markets can survive conflict. They rarely survive unpredictability. Inside Washington, the reaction was immediate and deeply personal. Trump reportedly viewed the move not as a strategic recalibration by allied governments, but as a public humiliation engineered by political adversaries and technocratic elites. According to multiple diplomatic sources later briefed on the exchange, voices were raised during a private communications call with allied representatives. One European minister would later describe the atmosphere as emotionally combustible, but the real damage had not yet begun. Because while headlines focused on Trump, institutional investors were already studying Carney, and that changed the financial psychology of the crisis. Unlike most political figures entering geopolitical conflict, Mark Carney carried something unusually powerful into the room. Credibility with markets, not voters, markets. There is a difference. Investors had watched Carney navigate the 2008 financial collapse at the Bank of Canada. They had watched him stabilize liquidity fears during Brexit at the Bank of England. They understood his language. More importantly, they understood his temperament. Calm signals calm. And in moments of systemic stress, temperament becomes economic policy. That distinction would soon reshape the entire confrontation. Within hours of assuming coordination authority, Carney avoided inflammatory rhetoric completely. No victory speech, no triumphalism, no emotional escalation. While political commentators demanded dramatic statements, Carney instead released a restrained institutional message focused on stability mechanisms, alliance continuity, and preservation of sovereign market confidence. The wording looked boring, which was precisely why markets trusted it. In New York, traders noticed immediately. The S&P futures decline slowed within 23 minutes of the statement's release. Canadian bond spreads stabilized. European banking exposure, which had begun widening aggressively at the open, suddenly plateaued. Currency volatility indexes pulled back from panic territory. One hedge fund strategist in Manhattan summarized the shift with brutal simplicity. Trump created uncertainty. Carney created a framework. That framework became the center of the geopolitical struggle. Because behind the headlines about alliances and diplomacy was a much larger reality. The global economy had become structurally dependent on institutional trust between allied powers. Supply chains, energy pricing, semiconductor coordination, military procurement, debt markets, shipping insurance, reserve currency flows. All of it depended on the assumption that the Western alliance structure remained predictable. Now that assumption was under pressure, and pressure reveals leverage. In Ottawa, emergency meetings stretched deep into the night. Advisors carrying thick briefing folders moved through secured corridors beneath fluorescent lights, while military transport vehicles quietly entered government compounds through underground access routes. Canadian intelligence officials reportedly warned that retaliatory economic measures from Washington could emerge within days. Agriculture, steel, automotive manufacturing, rare earth logistics, everything was suddenly vulnerable. Yet Carney's approach remained unusually restrained. That restraint confused many observers at first. Television commentators expected emotional retaliation, public confrontation, dramatic speeches about sovereignty and betrayal. Instead, Carney moved through institutions quietly, almost clinically, reinforcing bilateral relationships, one government at a time. Tokyo first, then Berlin, then Paris, then sovereign investment channels in the Gulf. No spectacle, just systems. And systems are where real power lives. Trump, meanwhile, escalated publicly. At a rally in Ohio less than 48 hours later, he described the alliance decision as a coordinated attack on American strength and warned of economic consequences for countries taking advantage of the United States. The crowd responded instantly. Financial markets did not, because markets were beginning to price something more dangerous than tariffs: governance risk. That phrase sounds technical, but governance risk changes everything. It changes lending costs, it changes investment timelines, it changes manufacturing decisions, it changes where capital feels safe. And once global investors begin questioning institutional reliability, the consequences spread far beyond politics. A senior Singaporean banking executive later described the atmosphere as the first moment in years when major investors openly discussed fragmentation inside the Western financial order. That conversation alone carried historic significance. For decades, the strength of the Western alliance system rested not only on military coordination, but on predictability. Allies disagreed constantly, but the machinery itself remained stable. Now the machinery was visibly shaking, and foreign ministries everywhere noticed. In Seoul, emergency trade consultations were accelerated. In Brussels, officials reopened contingency planning discussions once considered politically unthinkable. Germany's industrial sector quietly began reviewing North American exposure risks linked to retaliatory tariff structures. The implications expanded by the hour, but what happened next changed the negotiation permanently. 3 days into the crisis, leaked briefing documents revealed that several alliance members had already been preparing contingency economic frameworks months earlier, quietly, privately, without public acknowledgement. That revelation stunned Washington because it suggested the breakdown of trust had begun long before Trump's removal became public. Institutional trust takes decades to build and minutes to damage. And once allies begin preparing fallback systems, the relationship itself has already changed. Inside the White House, frustration reportedly intensified as administration officials realized allied governments were coordinating through economic channels increasingly insulated from direct American pressure. Carney's strategy was becoming visible now. He was not trying to defeat escalation emotionally. He was reducing its effectiveness structurally. That distinction mattered enormously because economic coercion depends on dependency. Reduced dependency and leverage weakens. Quietly, Canadian ministries accelerated energy export negotiations with European partners. Asian procurement channels expanded. Infrastructure financing discussions reopened across Atlantic corridors. Even pension funds became part of the strategic battlefield as institutional investors rebalanced exposure toward regions perceived as politically stable. Most voters never noticed these shifts. Markets did, always. By the second week, analysts at major financial institutions began using another phrase with increasing frequency: geopolitical repricing. The numbers were staggering. North American manufacturing exposure indexes fell nearly 11% across selected sectors. Insurance premiums tied to cross-border industrial shipping rose sharply. Several multinational firms quietly delayed expansion projects pending clarity regarding alliance stability. Clarity never came. Instead, the confrontation deepened psychologically. Trump continued operating through pressure. Carney continued operating through patience. One approach dominated headlines, the other influenced institutions, and institutions outlast headlines. Inside closed-door European Commission meetings, diplomats reportedly expressed growing concern that public escalation from Washington was accelerating strategic diversification efforts among allied economies. The fear was no longer temporary instability. The fear was permanent recalibration. Because once governments learn they cannot fully rely on existing frameworks, they begin building alternatives. History shows this repeatedly. Empires rarely collapse because rivals become suddenly stronger. They weaken because trust inside the system deteriorates faster than leaders realize. That realization was beginning to spread through financial circles with uncomfortable speed. Meanwhile, energy markets entered the equation. Oil shipping insurers began reviewing political risk premiums tied to North Atlantic routes. Natural gas contract negotiations became increasingly politicized. Strategic reserve discussions intensified across Europe. Every conversation carried the same underlying question. What happens if alliance fragmentation becomes structural instead of temporary? No one liked the answer. At a private dinner in London attended by senior banking executives and former central bankers, one attendee reportedly summarized the mood with chilling precision. We spent 30 years building an integrated system based on trust. Now everyone is stress testing what happens without it. The room reportedly went silent afterward, because everyone understood the implication. Economic systems run on confidence, and confidence is fragile. The deeper problem was not tariffs, not speeches, not even diplomacy. It was perception. Perception determines capital flows, and capital flows determine power. As the crisis entered its third week, another shift became impossible to ignore. Allies were beginning to coordinate around Carney's institutional style rather than Washington's political momentum. That shift was subtle at first, then measurable. Joint statements increasingly used language associated with financial stability and institutional continuity rather than retaliatory rhetoric. Trade ministers began emphasizing resilience frameworks instead of confrontation. Even military coordination discussions started incorporating economic continuity planning at unprecedented levels. The alliance was psychologically reorganizing itself around predictability, and predictability was becoming more valuable than dominance. That reality carried devastating implications for Washington, because power often mistakes size for durability. But durability depends on trust, and trust was eroding. In financial markets, the consequences became increasingly visible. Treasury volatility rose. Foreign demand for certain categories of long-duration U.S. debt weakened temporarily. Currency strategists began discussing whether geopolitical fragmentation could slowly undermine confidence in broader Western coordination mechanisms, not collapse, something more dangerous, gradual erosion, the kind investors notice long before politicians do. Meanwhile, Carney continued speaking in measured tones. No emotional outbursts, no theatrical retaliation, only institutional language, liquidity protection, trade continuity, cross-border stabilization, strategic coordination. To ordinary audiences, the language sounded dry. To markets, it sounded safe. That difference became the entire battle. At one emergency summit in Geneva, cameras briefly captured an extraordinary moment before negotiations began. Trump entered surrounded by advisors speaking rapidly, gesturing aggressively toward briefing documents. Across the room, Carney sat quietly reviewing a thin folder, while two European finance ministers leaned toward him listening carefully. No confrontation occurred. None was necessary. The contrast itself told the story. Emotion versus restraint. Pressure versus leverage, short-term theater versus long-term positioning, and everyone in the room understood which approach financial systems historically reward during instability. The answer is not ideological, it is mathematical. As manufacturing losses began affecting employment forecasts across multiple sectors, political pressure intensified everywhere simultaneously. Canadian exporters faced uncertainty. American agricultural groups warned of retaliatory damage. European industrial planners worried about supply chain fragmentation. Nobody escaped the consequences. Trade wars are expensive. Ego-driven trade wars become historic. But even then, the full scale of the transformation remained hidden from public view. Because the real shift was occurring inside strategic planning rooms, defense officials began incorporating economic fragmentation scenarios into security assessments. Intelligence agencies increased monitoring of adversarial powers attempting to exploit alliance fractures. China expanded diplomatic outreach aggressively across regions suddenly uncertain about Western cohesion. Geopolitical vacuums never remain empty for long, and rivals understood opportunity when they saw it. That realization triggered another wave of institutional anxiety. Because the crisis was no longer about Trump or Carney individually, it had evolved into a test of whether the post-Cold War alliance architecture could survive internal fragmentation under economic pressure. That is a very different level of crisis, one that historians study decades later. By early autumn, the financial damage had become measurable enough that even previously optimistic analysts began revising forecasts downward. Manufacturing confidence indexes weakened. Investment inflows slowed across politically exposed sectors. Cross-border financing costs increased modestly but persistently. Not catastrophic, something more ominous. Chronic instability, the kind that slowly changes global behavior. And behavior is what shapes history. Inside Washington, advisors reportedly urged de-escalation repeatedly, but public confrontation had already become politically embedded. Walking backward now carried its own risks. That is the problem with escalation. Once leaders build identity around confrontation, compromise begins looking like weakness. Markets understood this immediately, which is why investors increasingly shifted focus away from speeches and toward institutional continuity mechanisms emerging around allied coordination structures led by Carney and other technocratic figures. Not because technocrats inspire crowds, because systems prefer predictability, always. Late one evening in Ottawa, after another emergency coordination session, reporters briefly captured Carney exiting a government building beneath heavy security. Snow moved sideways across the streetlights. No statement was given, no dramatic gesture made. He entered the vehicle holding a thin briefing binder and disappeared into the motorcade without acknowledging cameras. The footage lasted less than 9 seconds on television. But inside financial circles, it circulated everywhere, because calm during instability communicates power. And increasingly, global institutions were interpreting calm as strategic strength. The final turning point came quietly. No dramatic summit collapse. No televised argument, just numbers. By the fourth quarter, several multinational corporations had permanently diversified portions of their North American dependency structures into alternative alliance corridors. Logistics contracts shifted. Infrastructure financing changed direction. Procurement relationships evolved. Slowly, then all at once. And once systems move, they rarely move backward completely. That was the moment officials realized the crisis was becoming irreversible. Not politically, structurally. The damage was no longer about temporary retaliation. It was about altered incentives, and incentives govern the world more reliably than speeches ever will. Years later, economists would debate whether Trump's removal from the alliance of 47 represented the beginning of a broader geopolitical transition, or merely the visible climax of tensions building for years beneath the surface. But people inside those rooms already knew the answer. The fracture had begun long before the headlines. The headlines merely revealed it, because the problem was never one negotiation, never one leader, never one summit. The problem was what the confrontation exposed about modern power itself, that alliances built on economic integration become dangerously vulnerable when trust collapses faster than dependency. That institutional credibility can become more powerful than political volume, that markets quietly judge behavior long before history does, and perhaps most importantly, that leverage cuts both ways. In the end, the world did not remember the loudest speech. It remembered who remained calm while the system shook, And somewhere between the emergency meetings, the bond markets, the frozen negotiations, the delayed motorcades, the silent briefing rooms, and the exhausted officials staring at glowing financial screens after midnight, a larger realization emerged. Global power in the 21st century would no longer belong automatically to the strongest nation. It would belong to the systems capable of preserving confidence during chaos, because confidence is modern civilization's invisible currency. Lose that, and even the largest structures begin to crack. The alliance survived, but it did not survive unchanged. Neither did the markets. Neither did the governments inside them. And long after the cameras moved on, officials across capitals continued studying those weeks in private briefings for one reason above all others. They had witnessed what happens when political emotion collides with institutional reality in real time. History rarely announces itself clearly while it is happening. This time it did. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.